Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be discussing item collection within a level or video game. When it comes to item collection, you first have to figure out how you're going to use item collection within a video game, why you're using it, and how to implement it. That's actually the hardest part of setting up item collection, because based on those things, it might change the artwork, the audio, and the programming within that item. So let's look at some of the ways we can use item collection within a game. The easiest ones are for collecting points and enemy deaths. In games like Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog, you're actually collecting gold coins just for points. In every first-person shooter you've played, you're actually collecting deaths. You can count how many headshots, how many people you've killed, how many assists you've helped with, anything like that. There are different types of players. One of the player types is called an achiever. Achiever player types are the type of people who like to achieve something. They want to collect things in order to earn something. Those are also the ones that like to unlock items and gain achievements. So the achiever might want to collect 100 gold coins in order to get a free life in Super Mario. There are also the explorer player types. Those are the people who like to explore the environment no matter what. They'd rather turn left and go down this crazy, scary forest than actually playing your game. And those people like to collect random items. They're usually the people that find all the Easter eggs that you've hidden in your level. So collecting Easter eggs is one, or just collecting random items as you walk down a path. A fun one that most people don't realize is that collecting items is actually a form of wasting time and slowing down gameplay. So if your game takes 2 minutes, your level takes 2 minutes to play, by adding in extra items that you can collect, it might take 5, 10, or 20 minutes to play just because different player types want to collect those items. This also changes the flow and the pacing of every level throughout the entire game, which then changes the entire game, or the flow and pacing of that game. You can also use item collection for changing levels or for resetting levels, meaning if you've collected 5 of 10 items in this level and you die, then you start the game over, or start the level over. But if you've collected 6 or more of the 10, then you start halfway through the level at a certain checkpoint. Or if you've collected 10 items, then you go to level 2, or some random door opens, which is then a different section of the level. Or you've collected X amount of achievements, which then lets you get the Sword of Lightning or whatever it may be. Item collection is also used a lot of times for inventory. Do you have this item, yes or no? If you do, go barter with this person. Whatever it may be, updating your inventory is huge. Something as simple as collecting bullets on the ground in a first-person shooter. You also need to be able to collect items for HUD and interface elements. Again, an example would be the bullets. Every time you collect an item of bullets or an ammo pickup, your HUD is going to update with the new number of bullets. Every time you have a health pickup, your health is going to raise or lower depending on the type of health pickup. This could do the same for magic, for mana, for some kind of superpower, some kind of weapon, whatever it may be. No matter what, okay? No matter what or why or how you collect an item, you're always doing it to lead the player. If there's a random ammo pickup and you need it, as the player, you're going to go in that direction to pick it up. If you're an explorer type and you're walking out in the middle of nowhere to collect an item, you're still leading that player with all the trees and bushes and buildings around them down that pathway to find that item, because they, as explorer types, know that item is there. So no matter what you're doing, you're always leading the player with collectible items. When it comes to setting up item collection or collectibles inside of a game engine, it doesn't matter what game engine you're using. No matter what type of collectible you're using, they all have 3 things in common. First, you need the item itself to be collectible, and you need the item in the engine. So that includes artwork, sound effects, whatever it may be. Then you need the programming that goes along with it. How do you collect it? When do you collect it? How does the computer know it's collected? How do you update the inventory? Things like that. And then you need some type of notification for the player that this stuff has actually happened. Does a menu pop up? Is there a sparkle? Is there some type of audio? Is there an item collection noise? Does some kind of screen text pop up on screen? Whatever it may be. So those three things are needed no matter what you're doing when it comes to item collection. You need the item itself, the code that makes it work, and the notification for the player that it has worked. Now in this example, we're going to be setting up everything we need to do in order to have item collection work in our level. We're going to be using Unity 4.3. You can try following along with this video in any game engine you like and in any version of Unity. However, this video only shows you how to do it inside of Unity 4.3. So before we dive into Unity, let's take a look at all the assets we're going to need in order to make this work. First up, for the item itself, we're going to need a 3D model to collect, something to put in our level and actually collide with. If we're going to collide with it, the item needs collision. So the question is, why are we going to collide with it? Well, we could have it to where when the player gets next to it, we can press a button on the keyboard to pick up the item, or we could even use our mouse to click on it. But in this case, when the player's running around shooting bad guys, jumping, and all these other things, the last thing they want to do is press a button on the keyboard or click on it with a mouse. So running into it, having the player collide with the collision on the item is the easiest way to do it. Now, since we're leading players around an environment, the easiest way to make a player go to an item is to have it glow. Now we all know this because in all of these games, if there's something that we need to do and we cannot figure out what it is, what happens? The item turns green, it turns orange, it flickers, it floats, it rotates, it does something to get the player's attention. So in this example, we're going to be making the item glow. Now since we're making it glow to lead a player, we need to know when the item is going to glow. And the easiest way to do that is to say, okay, if the player is in this area, glow. If the player is not in this area, don't glow. So for that, instead of doing some type of checks and balances in the programming to always check for the distance of the player, this could bog down your computer and cause a lot of processing issues. So what we're going to do is we're just going to set up a volume or area trigger around the item so that when the player goes into this area, the item glows. And when the player is not in this area, the item is not going to glow. So now let's take a look at the code. What code are we going to need to make all of this work? Well, first off, we're going to need the code that makes the glow turn on and off when we're in the right area, which also means we need code that says, is the player in the right area? And again, we could do this based on distance, but we're actually setting the distance up based on how large this volume trigger is going to be. The trigger itself is a specific distance away from the object. So we're also going to need code that says make the item disappear or destroy the object from the level when the player has collected it. We're going to need some type of code that updates the inventory that says you now have 10 objects instead of 9. We're going to need some type of code that checks for all the items being collected, meaning has the player collected 5? And if the player has collected 5, something's going to happen to let the player know they have achieved this. Now at the same time, and most importantly, we're going to need code that has checks and balances. Something like, if you're in the area, the item glows. But if you're in the area and the item has already been collected, then the item cannot glow because it's not actually there. It's already been collected. So in coding, you always need these checks and balances to make sure everything works without errors and without bugs. After that, we're going to need all the player notifications that we're going to tell the player that they've collected something. So we're going to need some type of audio, which then says we're going to need some type of programming or code that makes the audio play. We're going to need some type of on-screen text that says, you've collected an item, which of course means we're going to need some type of code for that as well. And then of course again, the code that we've already said that's going to make the item disappear, to make it look like the player actually collected it. Now keep in mind, on-screen text is not a good way of showing a player that they've done something. When you're in the middle of a game, especially something that's fast-paced like a first-person shooter, the last thing you want to do is stop what you're doing and read text on screen. So the only reason we're doing the on-screen text in this example is number one, to show you how to do it, and number two, for debugging. Debugging is a great way to know if your code is actually working, and having the text pop up on screen when something happens shows you that it actually worked, and based on the text that you put in the debug, it actually tells you what's happening. And we're going to go over this in more detail, but that is the breakdown of all the items we're going to need in order to make this work. And it does sound like a lot, but it's totally worthwhile in the end. So, in order to set up item collection again, what are some of the things we need? Well, first off, we need the item. So in my 3D models here in the project settings, I'm just going to grab this little statue that I've got, and I'm going to drag him into my scene. It doesn't matter where because I'm just setting up the item. You'll notice in my inspector to the right here that the position is not at 0, 0, 0. So it's going to be hard for me to work with. So I'm going to set this to 0, 0, 0, and you can use your tab key to tab over. And now that it's at the very origin of my scene, I'm going to press F to focus in on this object. So I have effectively added my object to my level. But the player cannot grab this or run into it because in the inspector here you'll see that there is no collision on this object. So I cannot even add code to the collision because it does not exist. So this big button here that says Add Component, I'm going to click on that. And collision is a physics-based component. So in physics, I could choose all of these things here, but I'm just going to choose a box collider. It is the most simple collision that I could come up with. So box collider. And you'll see that I have this green cube box collider thingy around my object. And that's perfect. I don't need anything fancier than that in order to do the code to collect my item. So let's take a minute and discuss this real quick. Do I really need a light or a glow above this object? No, I don't. But if you're talking about player pathing and leading a player to the object, we all know that having a light or a glow above it makes it awesome. Now also, can I create the light through code? Sure, you don't need to add it to your scene. You don't even need to add the statue. If you're a professional programmer, go ahead and do whatever you want. But this example is for someone who might not be a programmer and just wants to step through the overall item collection. So, in this example, I have a statue, it has collision, but now I need a light, something that can make it glow. Now I could make a texture glow if I wanted to, but I'm just going to add a light because it's just as easy. So I'm going to go up to Game Object, Create Other, and I'm going to go Point Light. Now because we hit F to focus in on the XYZ location of our statue or of our item to collect, that's exactly where it created our light. If I did not press F to focus, it could have created the light wherever it wanted. Hopefully it would have been at 0, 0, 0, but there's no way to know for sure. So you'll notice we have this light, and there's this weird radius thing with these little dots on it. Well, what exactly is that? That's the radius of our light. That's where the light is going to stop. So if this is just a little item to collect, we only need a little bit of a glow around it. We don't need much, just enough to make the item glow. So we're going to put it around there like that. And then just to make sure we see that it glows, in the inspector we're going to change the light to something really cool, maybe a bright green, maybe we change the intensity up some, and we totally want shadows. So we're going to do soft shadows so it fades a little bit. And that's that. Nothing too complicated about that so far. So we've set up our item to collect, we've added collision, and we've added a light so that it glows. And whatever items are around this will glow as well. So what else did we say that we needed? Well, we said that we needed some type of trigger volume or area volume so that when the player touches it, when the player is in that area, that the light is going to glow. So again, we're just going to click on our object and hit F to focus to get that XYZ location, and we're going to go Game Object, Create Other, and it's here somewhere, Cube. Okay, so this cube is a generic object in our game, or game object. We could use it however we want. It doesn't have to be a cube. So you'll notice in the inspector, we have a box collider. That means it's going to collide like a cube. And that's great, because right below it, it says, is this box collider a trigger? And we're going to say, oh yeah, it's a trigger. When the player touches it, do something. That's what a trigger is. When you touch it, you're triggering it. Then below it, it says, wait a minute, do you want to render this cube? And we're going to say, no, we do not want to render this cube. It's a trigger. It's not an actual object in our game that we want to make it pretty, like a building or a player, right? We're just using it as a trigger. So we're going to turn off that mesh renderer. And there you go. You have a trigger cube to be exact, that when the player touches this, it will do something, right? We don't have the code set up, but the object is there. The only problem is, this cube is so small, the player is not going to touch it until he touches the item. So we're going to use our scale tool, which should also be the letter R on your keyboard, and we are going to just make this some random size for now, but in your level you would scale this appropriately based on, where in the area you need it to be. So for example, let's say this is our cube, this is our area, and whenever the player touches this area, the light is going to turn on, it's going to glow green, so that the player knows, hey, this item is important. I need to go collect this item. Now, this is kind of a stopping point. We need to figure out, okay, well, we have 3 separate items in our hierarchy. We have a cube, a point light, and a statue. So if we're going to reference all of those in code, that's perfectly fine. They're 3 separate items that we can reference in code. That's great. But what if we're going to have 300 of these, like in Sonic the Hedgehog, 1 billion gold coins, right? Whatever it may be. It gets very hard to reference all of those things in code. So what we can do is we can create something called a prefab, which is basically a group. We're combining all of these items together, so we only have to reference that one item in code. And then we can have the code put on that prefab as part of it, so that we only write the code one time. And when we copy paste the code, it does it for each item. This is also called object-oriented code. So the object has the code. And that's great. So what we need to do is we need to figure out what code is going to go on each item. So what we can do is in our folder structure down here, it doesn't really matter where, but you might have some type of scripts folder set up. But again, it doesn't matter. It's totally up to you where you do it. In this example, we've already got some things set up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different pieces of code that we need to set up. Okay, so let's take a look at this. First, we have the item code. And what exactly is the item code going to do? Well, that piece of code is going to have, when you touch it, it disappears. When you touch it, it makes a sound. Things like that. Then we have the another piece of code for the collectible trigger volume. So what is this going to do? This is going to attach to that cube so that when the player touches it, it turns the light on and off. Okay? Then we have something here called game setup. You can call this whatever you want, game setup, game manager, game whatever, level manager, item collection manager, whatever you want. What this is going to do is this is going to run in the background constantly, asking, have you collected all the items? If you have, game over. Or if you have, open the door, whatever it may be. And then the text eraser here is something completely different. This is based on the text that's going to pop up on screen for our debugging text. And we'll get to that later on. Basically, it's just a little timer that makes the text disappear. So no big deal. So technically, we only have 3 for the item collection. We have the item itself that's going to be collected, so the code for that. We have the setup that says, have you collected all the items? And we have the trigger volume that says, when you touch this, turn the light on and off. So, first thing we need to do is we need to rename all of these things. So instead of point light, we can right click and rename, and say something like item glow light. For the statue, maybe we can call it item that you're going to collect. And maybe for the cube, we call that something like, trigger volume. So all pretty self-explanatory. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the item. Then we're going to hold, if you're on a Mac, it could be Command. If you're on a PC, it could be Control. I'm on a Mac, so we're going to hold Command, and we're going to grab the item glow. And we're also going to grab the trigger volume. So we're going to grab this entire item. Okay? And you could drag it down to the assets folder here, and you could create a prefab that way. But we're missing an important step. It's still technically 3 separate items. So we're going to have a hard time doing what we need to do. It's hard to reference it in code when it's multiple items. We already discussed this. So what we're going to do is create an empty game object, and we're going to use that as a group. And that's going to be our item. So I'm going to focus on this little collectible item, hit F to focus, so that I get that XYZ000, and I'm going to say game object, create empty. Create an empty game object. So you'll notice in our hierarchy here we have an empty game object. So I'm going to call that item to collect. That way, no matter how many we have, it always knows it's an item to collect. And then again, holding Command or Control if you're on a PC, I'm going to select the items that we're using, and I'm going to drag them into the item to collect. So now I can just click on that one item, I can move it wherever I want, and based on my level, if I need to change the size, shape, or rotation of that trigger volume, I can do that. I can move it around based on where my gameplay is. So that's cool. Okay? So let's just imagine this code is not here. Okay? And we're just going to right-click and say Create C# script. You could use Boo, you could use JavaScript, whatever you want, but in this example we're using C#. So let's do Create New C# script. Now I'm just going to say item number 2 because I've already got the item code, right? Then I'm going to create another one, create C# script, and call this collectible trigger volume 2, just in case I named it the same thing. And then I'm going to do another one, C#, and call it game setup 2. Okay, so again, you would not have this many codes, you would have just the single ones. So adding code to an object is as simple as taking item, the item code, dragging it on the item itself that we're going to collect, taking the collectible trigger volume number 2, dragging that on the trigger volume, and there you go. So we now have an item, and over here in the inspector you can see the code, right? The code is not doing anything because it's a blank text document. It's nothing special. So we have this code on this object that's eventually going to do something when we write it. We have an item, the light, that just glows. Nothing special, it's just a light. And then we have a trigger volume. Again, we're using it only as a trigger. We're not going to render it with textures or anything. And it has this script on it so that it's ready for something, whatever that may be. So now that we have this item to collect, if we know that we're going to create 5,000 gold coins like in Sonic the Hedgehog, we probably want to create a prefab that makes sense, right? So we can just copy paste it a billion times and use the same thing over and over and over again. So I'm just going to grab it in the hierarchy and drag it down to the project file here. When I let go, it creates this item, which I can open up with the little arrow and see everything that's inside of it. And you'll notice in the hierarchy, the item to collect is now blue. In Unity, that means it is a prefab. So we're at a stopping point again. You've created all of the assets that you need for your item to collect, and you've connected them all and created a prefab. Up next, we're going to save our file, right? You always want to save your file every time you do something amazing. So save your file, and then we'll get started on the programming. So if you double click on all of your C# scripts, they will open in a software called MonoDevelop. MonoDevelop is a standalone software, but it comes with Unity when you install it, and it's great for editing all of your code. You can see that I have my original item file, and then the item2 that we have created, the collectible trigger volume 2 that we created, the game setup 2 that we've created, and the text eraser that we briefly discussed. So, in your item C# script, you'll see something like this. It'll be basically blank, but it'll have some setup code. The using Unity Engine and using system.collections, that's referencing things inside of Unity. It's there because it needs to be there. Just like the public class item mono behavior is there as well, and the start and the update functions. It's all needed to be there when you create the file. However, it does not mean that we cannot change them. You'll see that my item2.c# script is also the public class name. So if I ever, for whatever reason, rename the C# script, I also need to rename the public class. Okay, as simple as that. Now, the start and the update, what do those functions actually do? The start function says, any code that's inside this function, do it as soon as the level starts. As soon as this item is in the level, start doing this, whatever it may be. The update function says, do this constantly every single time there's a new frame. So for example, in a game that's running 30 frames per second, the update function is going to do it 30 times, once per frame. 30 frames a second, 30 times a second, okay? So let's take a look at the code we're going to need for the item collection to put on the item. You'll see there's no start function and there's no update function here, okay? Let's discuss what we're doing. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a public variable that is in the form of GUI text, and we're going to name it text output. So as you've already guessed, that is the debug text we're going to do. Okay? So the question is, why are we doing public? Well, we're doing public because when you create a public variable inside of Unity, the editor itself changes to have a spot that you can put stuff into. And I'll show you that in a second. We're going to create a public audio clip variable, and we're just going to call that sound to play. So it's very generic. Whatever sound you want, if you want to play it when we collect an item, let's put it there. Okay? Now here's a different one. Public static integer item counter equals 0. Again, these are just variables. We can call them whatever we want. But the important part here is the public static. A public static variable inside of Unity means that you can reference it inside other code. Okay? So for example, in the item collect, we have this public static integer called item counter, but in the game setup file, we're actually looking for it, and we reference it this way, item.itemCounter. So if it's a public static variable, we can reference it by typing in the name of the C# code, putting a dot or a period, and then the variable again. So remember, in this update file of our game setup, we're constantly checking if this equals 2. So if we've collected 2 items, the text output that we're going to create later is going to say game over. Okay? So we're creating a public static variable in the item collection code so that we can reference it in other spots. So for the item, all we needed was some type of text output to say you've collected item number 1. Some type of audio to say bling, you've collected it. And some type of variable to say yes, you've collected 1 item. Okay? Now keep in mind, we don't need any of those. You could very well just, when you touch an item, have it disappear and that's it. But that's no fun. You need some type of really cool sound. You need some type of text. You don't need the text, but in our example you do. And then you need something to keep track of your inventory. So this item counter is our inventory. Yes, we have 5 items. Therefore display 5 items on the HUD, whatever it may be. So all of that is just setting things up. Down here on this onTriggerEnter, that's the fun part. So let's take a look. OnTriggerEnter means when you trigger something, when you collide, right? So when we're colliding with something. Now keep in mind, this code is on the item itself. So we're saying When something touches your collision, what is it? It's other. It's something other than yourself. So we're then going to say if that other object dot tag is the player, right? So if it's the player, do these things. Now the question is, what is a tag and what is the player? So let's take a look back in Unity here. If you have never done it before, if you don't know how to do it, what you can do is in your assets folder here in 4.3 of Unity, you can right click and you can say import package. Once you've imported that option there, you can go to character controller. Character controller has a ton of, not a ton, it's only got a couple, but this is where it has the programming to do a first-person shooter, a third-person, things like that. So what it's going to do is in a standard assets folder here, it's going to import the custom character controller. You can see here. We have third person and first person. The first person has no artwork because obviously you're not going to see it. So we're just going to do the first person for now, and we're going to drag that into our scene. Okay? And you'll see we have a first person controller already set up, and the first person controller comes with the camera. So for this other camera that is created generically, when you create a new file, we're just going to right click and delete it. Doesn't mean anything to us because we have a camera in the first person controller. Okay? So we have our first person controller inside the game. Again, how do we create a tag for this guy? Well, when we select him, in our inspector under tag, we can click on it and say player. Okay? If you want to, you can add a custom tag and you can say things like trigger volume, collectible, whatever you want. But for this guy, the player, we need player. And keep note, it's a capital P. So we now gave him the tag of player, which works great in MonoDevelop with our code. When the item is colliding with something and its tag is player, obviously it means the player is collecting it. So what's going to happen? We're going to play an audio source, put text on screen that says you collected it, update our inventory, and then delete the object or destroy it. So let's take a look. When it comes to playing a sound, every object can have a sound associated with it. However, you cannot play a sound if you've deleted the item from the game, right? You cannot eat a cheeseburger if there's no cheeseburger to eat. So what we're going to do is Unity has this really cool code called play clip at point. And what we're going to do is, again, we created this variable here called sound to play, and it's public. So in the editor, we can add whatever sound we want to it. So it's just going to say, take the audio source that we pick and play it at a point. And the point is going to be the transform position of the item. So wherever that item's transform position is where the sound's going to play. And since the player is there colliding with it to grab it, it's going to play the sound and the player's going to hear it. So we just have the variable here, sound to play, and we drop in whatever sound we want. The text output, once we create it, it's going to say you collected an item. And since we don't have any items yet, every time we collect an item, every time we collide with it, we're going to say item counter plus 1. And then we're going to destroy the item. Okay? So, again, currently our item code that you might have created is going to have the void start and the void update. We're just going to delete those because we don't need to do anything constantly or when we start. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to paste in the code that I've already written just to make it easy. Okay, but for you it's going to be blank and you're going to write in the code and you're going to save the file. So remember, we've already dropped the code onto the item, right? We already have that code. And remember, we created a public variable for it. Okay? We've already done that. So again, if you create that public variable, if you come back into Unity, you can see that we now have on the item that we've selected here, under our script, we have the text output where we're going to put our GUI text to actually have the debug code on our screen, and we also have the sound that we want to play. And you'll notice it says none, it's empty. So what we can do is we can grab our audio clip. It could be a WAV file, OGG, MP3, MP4, whatever you want. You drag it over, and that sound clip goes into it. So now the sound to play is going to be the button click noise. Obviously you want it to be some kind of really cool, awesome sound effect, but the button click is all I had at the moment, so that's what we're using. Okay, so we've done the item. Now we want to save our file, and then we want to go back into our code in MonoDevelop. And you'll notice that when you're creating things in Unity, you go back and forth quite a bit. So we now want to look at the collectible trigger volume, okay? This is the code that's going to go on the trigger volume. So we're going to create a public variable for a game object. Which game object? The light that we want to glow. So what we can do is, once this public variable opens up on the editor, we can drag our light in from that prefab as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, again, when this trigger volume is triggered, and it's triggered by something with the tag player, we're going to say, if the light that we're going to drop in has not been deleted from the game or is set to null, we're going to take that light, go into the light property, and change the intensity to 3. That way it's brighter, because the intensity is set to 1 currently. Okay? And again, that's if we have not deleted it yet, meaning it's not null. Okay? So the exclamation point equals means not equal to. So if the light to use is not equal to deleted, not equal to null. Okay? However, let's take a look at something else. When the trigger exit, okay, what that means is, and again, this is the trigger volume, when something exits it or is no longer colliding with it, do something. Okay, so when something stops colliding with it, stops touching it, and that something happens to be the player, and the light is still in the scene and not collected and not deleted, set its intensity to 0. So if the player is not in the area, don't glow. If the player is in the area, glow. If the player is in the area and the item is not there, don't glow. If the player has left the area and the item is not there, don't not glow, right? So all the checks and balances are inside this object, okay? So again, I'm just going to copy paste it over. Your file, again, will probably have the start code, the update code, and you'll see that we don't have update or start in this, okay? So I'm just going to Control-A, copy it over. And again, you'll notice that my code is collectible trigger volume number 2. So I need to make my public class here the same. I'm going to add a 2 and save my file. Okay, so let's take a look. We go back into Unity. You might want to refresh by right-clicking in the open area and refresh. And we'll take a look at our trigger volume because that's what has the code on it. And you'll see, hey, there's now this new public variable. Which light do we want to use? Which light do we want to glow? So from my prefab, I'm going to take that item that I want to glow, and I'm going to drag it down. So we already had the prefab we set up. We already attached the code to it. In the code, we opened up public variables so we could drop items into it. Now we can copy paste this prefab as many times as we want. And that code will always be on the same item, referencing the same light, referencing the same collision, referencing the same player tag variable. So we can copy paste that as many times as we want and it will always work. Again, this is going to be constantly checking for something to tell us when the game is over or a door opens or whatever it may be. And game setup might not make sense to you. You might want to call this level 5 item collection code checker or something like that. It's totally up to you what you call it. But for me, I'm calling it game setup because this is my game that I'm showing you and we're setting it up and there we go. So what do we want to do? Well, just for fun, when the level starts, I'm going to hide my cursor. So I'm going to do screen.showCursor equals false. That way when I click on the screen to play the game, my cursor is going to disappear, so I no longer see the mouse. That way I can just focus on WASD and spacebar to jump. Otherwise I stare at the mouse and it gets in the way. What else are we going to do? Well, we're going to create again a public variable that opens up a slot in the editor for our text output. Again, the text output is going to say you've collected an item or whatever you want it to say, strictly for debugging. Okay, so if we're debugging, what exactly are we doing? Well, every single frame, 30 frames a second, we are going to check the item code that we created, and we're going to check for the variable item counter. So that when the item counter is equal to 2, the text output that we're going to create, the text portion is going to say game over. So when you collect one item, it's going to say you've collected an item. And when you collect the second item, it's going to say game over, or go to level 2, or achievement unlocked, whatever it may be. So the question is, how do we get this game setup code in our level? Where exactly do we put it? Well, you could put it wherever you want. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty game object. So I'm going to go back to Unity and I'm going to say game object create empty. That way I know for a fact there's this thing in my level somewhere that has this code on it. And I'm going to say rename, and I'm going to call it game setup manager or code holder or container or whatever. And I'm going to grab that game setup file that we created, and I'm going to drag it on there. So when the game starts, what's going to happen? It's going to hide the cursor when I click on the screen, and it's going to constantly check for item collection to equal 2. Okay? So again, I have to copy this over because I'm creating this during the video here. So copy that, my game setup 2. I'm going to paste it in, and again change my public class here, and save it. So in Unity, we might want to refresh. Okay, so on our game setup manager, again, you can see this text output has a blank slot for where the text is going to go. So let's actually create that GUI text. The easiest way, game object, create other, GUI text. Now what GUI text is? GUI is your your user interface basically, and the text means it's going to be text. So we're just going to leave it GUI text. Doesn't matter what we call it, okay? But if you want, you can tell the anchor to be in the center, the alignment to be the center of your screen. You can change the font. You can add a material. You can have the font size to be 12, 24, whatever you want. You can have the color to be green. It's totally up to you. It's your game. You make it whatever you need it to be. So let's go back into that item to collect, and let's click on the item. You'll see again the text output is looking for that GUI text because whenever we collide with the item, we want it to say you've collected an item. So I'm going to grab the GUI text and drag it down. Okay. On the light, there's no code on the light. On the trigger volume, there's nothing looking for our text. But on our game manager, if you remember, there's a slot here that's constantly checking for if you collected the items. And if you did, if you've collected 2, it says game over. So obviously, to have text, we need that GUI text. So we're going to drag it over again. So everything should be set up. So now we're going to save our file and then try it out. You probably noticed that the text on the screen stayed there. It was in the way and it never disappeared. Well, that's where this text eraser code came from. If you remember in the beginning, I said there was a text eraser code that we created just to make it disappear. So here's where we're actually going to figure it out. You'll see that in C#, I created a float variable called myTimer, and this is just a timer. It's going to count from 2 to 0, and when it's at 0, it's going to make the text disappear. A float means it is a decimal number, 2.0, 3.5, 18.6, whatever it may be. Whereas an integer is a solid number like 0, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. There's no decimals. So since we're dealing with time, I wanted it to be a float. So what's going to happen is it's going to constantly check at 30 frames a second or more, whatever I set my game to. It's going to say, if the GUI text that we created is not equal to nothing, okay? When it comes to text editors, if you do the quotation with nothing in the center, that basically means there's no text, there's nothing there. And again, the exclamation point equals means not equal to. So if our GUI text is not equal to nothing, meaning there's text on the screen, If it says you've collected an item, right, that means there is text. Okay, so if there's text on the screen and your timer is greater than 0, then you're going to count down. Okay, so my timer minus time. Okay, now it's kind of crazy to think about it, but time.delta time means seconds. Okay, time.delta time means seconds. It's a game engine thing, you just got to deal with it. You don't have to go into wondering why it means what it is, just know that delta time means time. Okay, so my timer, we're going to subtract seconds. Okay, and then we're constantly checking. If your timer is less than or equal to 0, it means your time is done, and you're going to set the text to nothing. Because remember, the two things with nothing in between means nothing. Then you're going to set the timer back to 2 so you could check it again. Okay? So again, we're going to take that GUI text and we're going to drag that text eraser right onto that GUI text. Okay? So this text eraser is constantly checking if text is on the screen. If text is on the screen, which it will be because every time we collect an item, it's going to say you've collected an item, right? So if there's text, it's going to start counting down from 2 to 0, okay? And if it gets to 0, we're going to clear that text and start the count over. Okay, so if there's no text on screen, this code will not happen. But if there is text on screen, 2 seconds later, it'll disappear. So again, save all your text files, put them where they need to be, and save your Unity file as well before it crashes, because game engines are notorious for crashing. Okay? Now you'll notice in my level here, I do not have anything to walk around on, so I'm going to stop the video, build a small level, and I'm going to scatter a couple items around, and then we'll test it out. And I've added a floor. So I've checked this ahead of time to see what could have possibly gone wrong, because there are some things I wanted to show you, and we're going to run through those real quick. Step 1, make sure your player is above your floor. Otherwise, he'll fall through. So after you've done that, let's push play. Okay, so what do you see? First off, the GUI text said GUI text, so that's obviously an error. Number 2, our glows for our items are already glowing, but they should not be glowing until we're in the area that trigger volume is. So, what do we have? Make sure the player starts above the ground, make sure the GUI text does not have text, make sure your light intensities are set to 0, and just for fun, make sure you can actually see the trigger volume area so you know if you're even in the area to begin with. Okay? Now, let's run over and check them and see if they even disappear. So, by running into this, nothing's happening. So what could it possibly be? Well, let's press stop and let's check. So, number 1, click on your GUI text in the hierarchy, your GUI text, not GLUI text. And in the text for the inspector, just delete it so it's blank. That's done. Select on your lights, set the intensity to 0 for all of them. Now again, when we created our prefab, we should have done that ahead of time, but we didn't think about it. Okay? Now, let's click on the item and see why when we touched it, nothing happened. You'll see that under our box collider, I could have sworn that we set it to trigger, but I guess we did not. So we're going to click on set it to trigger for both of them. Okay? And now for our trigger volume, we're going to turn that mesh renderer back on so we can actually see it in the level. Okay? So the good thing about prefabs is you can always go in and change them. But let's say that you made so many mistakes that it's just horrible and you need to redo your prefab. You can always select it in the editor and go Game Object, break Prefab Instance, and then you could just drag it back down to your project again to create a new prefab. So we're not going to do that in this example, but you could always do that if you wanted to. So now that we've made those quick changes, we're going to hit play. So the GUI text did not show up, the items are not glowing, and we can now see our environment to see when we touch that trigger volume. So I come over here, okay, it lights up when I touch it, it turns off when I'm not in the area. Then when I collect it, I come over here, it plays a sound, and it says you collected an item, and 2 seconds later it disappears. So again, I'm walking around my game, I'm in the area, it turns on, I collect it, says you collected an item. Right? So there we go. We've collected 2 different items, and it said we collected 2 items. So keep going, have fun, and make item collection.